Okay, I hope you can hear me. It's a pleasure to introduce this seminar by Hannu Vartiainen on renegotiation in renegotiation in mechanism design. It's a fascinating topic. I had a look at the paper. The paper is very technical. It's not my field, but I think it's a fascinating topic because it appears in many different parts of game theory or economics. We tend to think that something is stable if it's not profitable to deviate, but sometimes we check for that something is robust against deviation, but the deviations are quite stupid themselves, right? So maybe something is stable even if there are deviations, because profitable deviations, because the deviations themselves are unstable. So I think that this is an interesting point. It's a very interesting topic to discuss, and I think that the interest it's larger than mechanism design. So I think that I really look forward for this paper because I think it has an important message for economics and game theory at large. So thank you, Hannu. I leave the floor for you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Luciano. Thank you very much for the introduction, and all of you, Manfred in particular, for inviting me to this prestigious occasion to give a talk. It is truly a pleasure. So, as Luciano mentioned, yes, my talk, the title of my talk is recursive contract, or recursively renegotiation-proof contracts. Recursively renegotiation-proof contracts. What does that mean? So, okay, let me give you a little bit of the background here. In mechanism design, in case some of you are not very familiar with mechanism design literature in detail, so mechanism design literature is about contracts or incentive structures that incentivize agents to communicate their private information to the mediator in truthful fashion, and in a way that makes incentives compatible among the agents to behave according to the objectives of the planner. Now, the crucial assumption behind mechanism design literature, which is of course huge, and it basically shapes all microeconomic theory at the moment, the crucial assumption behind mechanism design, game theory, if you wish, more generally, is that the rules of the game are there. That once you design a mechanism, contract, or a game, they all are more or less synonymous structures. Whenever you design the game, those are the rules that the players are expecting to play. When they are, those are the structures that the players, within which the players choose their optimal strategies. And of course, we take them as a designers, we take them as given that, or that's the basic starting point, that because of the structure is given, we can predict what is the behavior of the agents and in what way their incentives can be made aligned with the objectives of the planner. So this is the basic idea of mechanism design. Now, there is this challenge that the rules of the game are always given. Of course, in many natural scenarios, they are not given. In fact, quite often it is the key rule of the game or the contract is that the rules of the contract, the game, can be changed by someone at some later point. I mean, this is something that we, of course, observe quite often in many practical situations. Think about the European Union institutions there, but more specifically, think about trading situations. You set up a mechanism, let's say an auction, but nevertheless there might be an option to retrade the good after the auction has been played. So changing the rules of the game is not just a sort of hypothetical scenario or not just a sort of a minor issue. It is in practice prevalent question in most of the mechanism design scenarios. In fact, there quite well can be the case that after information has been revealed within the mechanism, the players, the agents, are in a situation where it is beneficial from the viewpoint of all parties to change the rules of the game. And if that is the case, it should be particularly challenging to prevent changes in the rules. If everyone benefits from those changes exposed, but that in particular distorts the incentives ex ante to report truthfully your private information to the mechanism. So this is not only a sort of a practical challenge, but it's also a conceptual challenge to the mechanism design literature. How should we think about mechanisms whose rules can be changed or renegotiated at some later stage of the game? In particular, because all the mechanisms affect information of the agents through the process of generating an output, it is unavoidable that the ex post information is different from ex ante information, and therefore it is quite possible that given this ex post information, the agent would like to change the rules. So that is the question. Of course, I'm not the first one to point out this conceptual difficulty. In fact, there is a quite lively recent debate about the topic. But rather than going to the most recent contributions, in particular, most recent Econometrica contains a couple of papers on this issue. But their approach is a little bit different from mine here. So I would rather refer to a little bit earlier literature initiated by Matthias de Vatripont in '89, François Forget 95, and Svikan Neyman and Alexander Pavlov 2012, 13 actually. So in this literature, the question is what kind of mechanisms are feasible if we make the condition or impose an additional constraint on the mechanism in addition to the usual incentive compatibility and individual rationality constraint, that the mechanism is such that the agent would not want to renegotiate it at any later point, so that there would not be mutually beneficial renegotiation opportunity to the agents at some later stage of the game. This was the issue or the question analyzed by, for example, these contributions, others as well, and it was coined in this literature as the notion or this criterion as renegotiation proofness. So so let me rephrase what renegotiation proofness means. Suppose that at some later stage of the mechanism, it is indeed in the interest of all parties to change the rules of the game. Now, when I'm planning the mechanism, I suppose I'm the planner. In fact, all the agents will anticipate that as well. So suppose that the planner and the agents anticipate in what way the mechanism will be renegotiated at some later stage. Then this anticipated renegotiation should be incorporated into the original mechanism. But that, of course, means that the incentive compatibility of the original mechanism breaks down. And what follows is that in the end, the players are not playing truthful strategies within the original mechanism, but something else. But then if they play something else, some other strategies, they in fact may not want to renegotiate it in the way that they originally anticipated, because the information revealed by the mechanism is not such that was predicted by the original renegotiation procedure, because it was based on the idea that the mechanism is incentive compatible and the agents are revealing their types truthfully to the mechanism. So it's kind of, if there is this incentive to renegotiate, the whole incentive compatibility structure breaks down, and we don't know what's going to happen afterwards. So that is the reason why it is safe to focus on renegotiation-proof mechanisms which are not subject to renegotiation at the exposed stage. Any other mechanism, we don't actually know what's going to happen within the mechanism. So that's why the objective of these papers was to focus on what is the criteria, what does it mean that we impose this additional criterion of renegotiation proofness on mechanisms. There are a couple of versions of renegotiation proofness that we or renegotiation that we may want to think about. Like devotary pond, we may want what we might think is a kind of a very simple way to renegotiate. Rather than implement the outcome that was generated by the mechanism, we simply choose something else, another outcome, if that is more beneficial, given the exposed information, than the outcome suggested by the original mechanism. But there is actually a stronger version of renegotiation, and that was applied by Niemann and Pavlov, where the outcome of the mechanism can be replaced by a further renegotiation procedure, additional mechanism, given the exposed information. And of course, this imposes even more stringent criterion on mechanisms than the weak form of renegotiation, namely, mechanism should be such that, given the exposed information, there should be no additional mechanism that would be incentive compatible with respect to this exposed information that would benefit all the parties in comparison to the originally suggested recommended outcome. If mechanism is renegotiation proof in this particular sense, then it is very robust. Unfortunately, renegotiation proofness using this strong criterion is probably too strong a condition, because quite often such a mechanism doesn't exist. Think about the following canonical scenario: bilateral bargaining. The setup studied by Martin and Serfeld in their 83 paper. There is a buyer and the seller, one single good that they are trading. Each buyer and the seller's benefit type from consumption is drawn from a unit interval. It's their private information. Efficient trade should take place whenever the buyer's valuation is higher than the seller's valuation. However, Myerson and Satterthwaite showed that there is no efficient, incentive compatible, individually rational, and budget balanced mechanism. In other words, think about so let's to give a sort of a graphic interpretation of this picture of the result. Suppose that we are in this unit square, where the buyer's valuation is in the vertical axis, the seller's valuation is in the vertical axis. Now, the blue dots in the upper left triangle refer to the areas, to the combinations of the buyers and the sellers types under which efficient trade should take place. However, Myerson and Satterthwaite showed that the welfare maximizing, incentive compatible, individually rational and budget balanced mechanism is one where trade will not take place in the blue area, but rather in the blue area, in the triangle in here, but rather in the blue area, such as this, in this figure, in the left upper area above the curve in here. So the red dots describe the area where efficient trade should take place, but it doesn't. In the welfare maximizing, incentive compatible, individually rational and budget balanced mechanism. So what we conclude from here, from this result by Myerson and Satterthwaite, is that every mechanism is necessarily inefficient, in a sense that mutually beneficial trading opportunities are left on the table, even though a buyer and the seller are free to negotiate over the trade. So what does that mean? It implies that there is going to be situations, it's unavoidable that there are going to be situations where the bargaining stops at a situation where both the players, both the agents know that there is scope for further mutually beneficial trade. So, and this is true for any trading mechanism. That's the implication of the result by Myerson and Satterthwaite. So, the question here is, what will happen if we use any mechanism in this scenario, in the bilateral bargaining scenario? In particular, the incentive efficient mechanism that identified by Myerson and Satterthwaite that maximizes social surplus. Any such mechanism is subject to renegotiation. The agents are tempted to continue negotiation after trading procedure should have stopped. So this is a kind of a conceptual challenge. What should we think about this situation if every mechanism stops in an inefficient trade, and at that point renegotiation should take place? In other words, there is no renegotiation-proof mechanisms. There is no renegotiation-proof mechanism in this bilateral bargaining scenario. So that is the challenge to the models of bilateral bargaining, but it's in particular a challenge to the notion of renegotiation proofness, because it is simply it's a simply inadequate way to think about renegotiation proofness in many scenarios, because it leads to empty set of solutions, in particular in bilateral bargaining. So this is the topic of the current paper. So the challenge or the problem with renegotiation proofness in this, for example, in the bilateral bargaining situation, is that it tests the original mechanism against any new mechanism. There should be no second stage mechanism that blocks the first stage mechanism. Of course, there is a kind of a conceptual challenge in this way of thinking about renegotiation proofness, because the second stage mechanism, how do we know that it is not renegotiated itself? We simply assume in renegotiation proofness by Devat-Ripont or by Neyman and Pavlov that the second stage mechanism is simply not subject to further renegotiation. Of course, conceptually clean solution would be one where the same criterion as we put on the first stage mechanism is imposed also on the second stage mechanism, that it should be as well, in a similar way, robust against further renegotiation. But of course, that implies that also the third stage mechanism should be robust against further renegotiation, and so forth and so on, ad infinitum. So credibility of a mechanism is tested against credible redesigns, which is tested against credible redesigns, which is tested against credible redesigns, so forth and so forth and so on. And that's where the title of the talk comes from. Recursive renegotiation proofness. We want to give body on this idea of recursive renegotiation proofness as a criterion. So I'm going to formulate a solution that captures precisely this idea in a tractable and understandable manner, hopefully understandable. I'm going to give a reduced form characterization of direct mechanisms that survive this criterion, and the criterion are based on certain consistency conditions that I'm going to be very explicit about. Perhaps most importantly, so I'm going to give a characterization of the solution, but perhaps most importantly, I'm going to also show the general existence of the solution under the rather general conditions. It's portable to any mechanisms in design scenario, by the way. There is going to be, unlike in many other mechanism design setups, there is going to be a procedure through which the solution can be identified. It is a fixed point, but it's not fixed point like Kakutani fixed point, which is difficult to compute. It is based on a recursive procedure based on Tarski's fixed point, and that's why there is a procedure. It's based on transfinite induction, so it's going to be rather sort of a long procedure, possibly, but nevertheless, there is a procedure. And then I'm finally going to apply the solution to bilateral bargaining situation that we studied a couple of slides ago. So this is the plan of this talk. By the way, if you have any questions or comments, do not hesitate to interrupt me. I'm trying to keep the formalism as low as possible, but nevertheless, some structure needs to be put on the setup. So there is a compact set of outcomes and a set of probability distributions over this set of physical outcomes. These are the objects that the agents are interested in. So there is a set of agents, finite set. Each has a private set of types, theta I, and then there is a prior belief over the types of the agents. Beliefs are updated using a bias rule. And then finally, there is each agent has a continuous payoff function over the set of physical outcomes, which is conditioned on the types of all the agents. So that implies that we have common values environment. So no restrictions on the types, on the utility functions is put in that sense. So it's a common values environment. Most of the mechanism design literature in thinking about, if you think about auction theory, is based on independent values case. So this is a particularly general setup in that sense. No assumptions concerning quasi-linearity of the utility functions is made. Of course, that is a sort of a leading interpretation that we have in mind, but none of the general results are dependent on quasi-linearity assumption. Now, let me formalize the idea of commitment or lack of commitment. So the agents, think about, put the hat of a mediator on your head, and think about trying to maximize the utility of the agents. How would you do that? Well, you need to invoke a mechanism. A mechanism here is a mapping M that takes as input the types of the agents or messages of the agents of their types, and then it generates as an output an output message called S. And S is now a combination of two things. It's the first element, the first entry in S is a recommendation of a physical outcome that is to be implemented or is recommended to be implemented. And then the second entry in the output message of the mechanism is a pair of irrelevant signal omega, whose only role is to affect potentially to the exposed beliefs of the agents. So in particular, if we have an incentive compatible mechanism where the agents report their types truthfully to the mechanism, omega might be such that it reveals perfectly the types of the agents. In the other extreme, you could think about the mechanism as a black box where it only reveals the output of the associated the output that is to be that it recommends to be implemented, and no further information. Then omega would be constant in some sense. But even in that case, the mechanism does reveal some information. It reveals the output that is recommended, which is conditioned, at least in some sense, typically, on the types of the agents. So this is what a mechanism here does. And it recommends an outcome to be implemented, and it designs exposed information. The design part is usually absent in the standard mechanism design literature. It is absent because we are not interested in exposed beliefs. There is no renegotiation exposed in the standard mechanism design scenario. Here, it is precisely the exposed situation, exposed beliefs that we are interested in. It forms the incentives of the agent to renegotiate the outcome, or under the exposed beliefs, they do have or do not have the incentive to renegotiate the outcome. So that's why managing exposed beliefs is highly important. And that has been the crucial theme, absolutely central theme in the most recent literature on mechanism design without commitment. So now from the at this stage we make a notational convention from this onwards in this talk. The omega, the payoff irrelevant signal of the message, we can simply interpret that or label that signal by the posterior belief that it generates. So in fact, we can identify the signal with the posterior belief that it generates, and it then has to be consistent with Bayesian updating given the output message of the mechanism. So this simplifies the notation that we are going to develop here. So of course this is just a mechanism. There has to be some constraints on mechanism in order to incentivize the agents to reveal their types, coordinate their information or incentive. It has to coordinate the incentives of the agents for them to inform their types truthfully to the mechanism. So the mechanism is incentive compatible if the expected payoff to agent I with expected payoff of agent I with type theta I, when we are using mechanism, assuming that the mechanism's recommendation is always implemented given prior belief P, when the agent reports type theta prime I to the mechanism, it's this U thing over here. Now the mechanism is incentive compatible if it's true that reporting truthfully to the mechanism generates at least as high payoff to the agent as misreporting his type. That's and that has to be true for all the agents I with all the types theta I and all the misreports theta prime I. Now, if that is the case, then mechanism is incentive compatible. It is individually rational, so it's incentive compatible. It's individually rational given the status quo outcome X if it's true that the mechanism generates at least as high payoff under truthful reports than what is outcome that X gives agent under type theta I with belief P of the other agent's types. Now X is not simply dependent only on theta I of agent I, type of agent I, but also the types potentially of so the utility of agent is not only dependent on his own type, but potentially also on other agents' types. So therefore, it is important what is the belief concerning the other agents' types. So, but these are basically the relevant constraints in mechanism design literature: incentive compatibility and individual rationality. Now, given status quo outcome X, prior belief P, let's denote by M, capital M, the set of incentive compatible and individually rational, or in the language of Meyerson, incentive feasible mechanisms. Now, these are the feasible mechanisms given X and P. Let's call X and P a context. From this on, X, the underlying status quo outcome, the current beliefs, is a context. And now we can readily see in a very sort of a transparent manner the recursive structure that we have in our problem. So think about a mechanism that is incentive feasible in context XP. It is renegotiation proof if for all possible output messages of the mechanism X prime P prime, there is no another mechanism M prime that is incentive feasible given the context X prime P prime, such that for all agents types, the new mechanism M prime is at least as good as the recommended outcome X prime for all the agents, and assuming that this is strict for at least one agent. That's renegotiation proofness criteria by Neyman and Pavlov. And indeed, the question is applied to for example, the bilateral bargaining situation. What if there is no renegotiation proof mechanism? And now, as I alluded earlier, the idea is to require that M prime itself should be renegotiation proof. And now there is the recursive structure. Okay, so what is the solution to this recursive problem? The problem is to draw a contract which is not just a mechanism that is implemented today, but it has a recursive structure. It has a recursive structure in a sense that it does not only specify the mechanism that we are going to draw today, but it also recommends another mechanism that is going to be played if we deviate, if we renegotiate the current mechanism. So let me repeat. Suppose that we play the planner, the mediator, designs a mechanism today. And that's part of the contract. Now the contract recognizes that the agent, the mediator, may want to change the outcome by initiating outcome of the mechanism by initiating renegotiation. Then the contract specifies what will happen if this deviation takes place. A third mechanism, which is to be played. And if that is going to be renegotiated, then there is going to be fifth mechanism, the fourth one being the second renegotiation, and so forth and so on. So this is the recursive structure of the contract. So the contract is going to be history dependent. It does not only specify what's going to happen today, but it's going to specify, after all hypothetical renegotiation histories, what's going to happen next. So it's a contract in a sense that it specifies that if we do this and that, then what's going to happen after that. And it recognizes that at any stage of the contract, the agents may want to renegotiate the contract. Of course, the idea of the contract is that at no stage the mechanism, the contract will not be challenged. There is no incentive of the agents to renegotiate the contract at any stage because they know that if they are going to renegotiate it today, then tomorrow they are going to renegotiate our renegotiation as recommended by the contract. So the contract is robust against any the objective of the contract is to be robust against any renegotiation at any stage of the game or any stage of the procedure, after any hypothetical history of renegotiations. That's the content of the sort of intuitive content of the contract. And now we are going to give some structure of what does it mean. Rather than specifying all possible counterfactual sequences of histories, finite sequences of redesigns, let us describe a contract as an automaton. This is an equivalent, somewhat more compact way of describing history-dependent renegotiation. So an automaton is a tuple consisting, automaton called gamma is a tuple consisting 4 elements, where Q, capital Q, is a set of states, and the state is just a sort of it's part of the contract. It's not state of nature, it's part of the contract that specifies what we should do under different circumstances. It provides, it's a vehicle, that vehicle of information between different scenarios. And there is in particular an initial state Q naught, where the original mechanism is designed. Then there is a transition function that specifies tau, that specifies conditional on the current state and the mechanism that we just observed and the outcome of the mechanism that materialized. It specifies another state. So it's a transition between states. So as I said, this is the way that information is transferred across different scenarios where new mechanism is designed. And then there is a choice rule or renegotiation function. Actually, in the current version of the paper, I think that I call it renegotiation function, sigma, which is conditioned on the state. That's the state. The state Q, the current state Q, and the current context in which the mechanism is designed. And it's just a mechanism which is required to be incentive feasible given the current context S. S is the context, combination of X, the status quo outcome, and the current belief. Now, the design strategy or the recursive contract works as follows. Let's call the combination of state and context, state Q, context S, as configuration. In configuration Q and S, if the choice rule, renegotiation function, specifies a mechanism, then this mechanism is going to be played. And if its realization output message is S prime, then the next stage configuration comes from the transition function given the original state Q, and then the mechanism that we used M, and the output message of the mechanism S prime, and then that S prime context, the output message is also the context, forms a new configuration. Now, if the choice rule or calls to implement a constant mechanism, then that is interpreted as implementation of the current context or outcome, that is status quo outcome that is on the table given the current beliefs, and then the decision process ends. So this is what a recursive contract in this formulation is. It specifies implicitly a mechanism for each counterfactual history of renegotiation or whatever sequence of mechanisms we choose, it chooses it proposes either a mechanism to be implemented or the current status quo outcome to be implemented. Now, this is a recursive contract, and this is the structure that we want to impose some conditions on that guarantee that renegotiation will never take place. How do we do that? So, how do we guarantee that in particular that when the choice rule calls to implement the current status quo, that this is indeed what will happen if the agents are free to renegotiate, if there is a mediator who finds another mechanism rather than S to be more profitable to all the agents than implementing S, or the current status quo outcome. This is what we next want to identify. But in order to do that, suppose that we have a recursive contract gamma. We can identify through the recursive contract a set sigma, which is the set of mechanisms, feasible mechanisms under context configuration Q and S that have the feature that if we choose that mechanism, M, and employ that, then in the next stage, through the transition function, the next stage configuration is such that it always, our choice rule always implements the output that is generated by the mechanism. So, if that is the case, then our choice rule is such that it implements mechanism M. These are the feasible mechanisms that the mediator could choose, assuming that the choice rule is going to be played in the next round, without a fear of the mechanism being renegotiated according to the contract. Now, so in principle, the mechanisms in sigma gamma given configuration QS are mechanisms that that are feasible for the mediator under current configuration QS. Now, this choice set facilitates us with criteria that the recursive contract has to meet. First of all, recursive contract has to be consistent in a sense that the choice rule under each configuration chooses from the set from the choice set that the recursive contract spans at that configuration. Namely, the contract is consistent if the choice rule under each possible configuration is such that the recursive contract doesn't call for changing the output of the recommended mechanism at every configuration. That is simply a consistency criterion implying that the mechanism suggested by the recursive contract after any counterfactual hypothetical history is not redesigned by the contract itself. So that's the first criterion. The second criterion, which is a little bit more subtle, is that we need to guarantee that the choice set under each configuration, in fact, contains all the mechanisms that are feasible for the mediator. So that, for example, or in particular, the mediator couldn't induce an alternative mechanism, sort of a two-stage mechanism, a compound mechanism, where he first chooses a particular mechanism which is not in the choice set, but then, given that it is renegotiated according to the contract, then the compound mechanism, the original mechanism and the renegotiated mechanism, or the renegotiation, thinking about this compound thing as a one single mechanism. If that is incentive feasible, namely incentive compatible and individually rational, then the mediator could circumvent the restriction implied by the choice set. And indeed, we want the choice set to reflect all the possibilities, mechanism possibilities that the mediator could have at hand under any particular configuration. So the way to prevent this from happening is to require completeness from the contract, in a sense that if we take a mechanism M and form a compound mechanism by adding to that mechanism the renegotiation according to the contract, namely sigma, and called sigma current state plus the mechanism as the compound mechanism that results from this procedure. If we take all possible compound mechanisms like that for any M, any mechanism for varying mechanism M, if that such a compound mechanism is incentive feasible, then it has to be part of the choice set. That guarantees that the choice set contains all the feasible mechanisms that the mediator could employ. And that's what I mean by completeness of the recursive contract. Now the final condition. So these both conditions, completeness, consistency, guarantee that first of all that any mechanism in the choice set is implementable. They are all incentive compatible, individually rational, under the hypothesis that sigma is followed ex post, and no mechanism in the choice set is not implementable. Hang on, no mechanism is not. No mechanism is. Sorry, no, one not too much. No mechanism is implementable under the hypothesis that sigma is followed ex post. So, in particular, the choice set capital sigma contains all the feasible mechanisms that can be played if the mediator so chooses. Now the question is how to guarantee that indeed there is not going to be any deviation to sigma ex post or at any other stage. It's the optimality condition that we are going to introduce next. And there okay, so it's a little bit like renegotiation that we introduced before, but now there is a small discount factor, delta, which is a number which is presumably close to 1, but not quite 1. So there is a small, arbitrarily small cost of renegotiation here. So a mechanism M delta dominates M prime at context XP if it's true that utility of all agents from mechanism M, expected utility, times delta is at least as high as the utility from M prime for all the types of the agents that are that could have a positive probability under P, the current belief. Now, recursive contract is delta optimal if at any configuration there is no mechanism in the choice set, namely a feasible mechanism that is not going to be renegotiated, that delta dominates the suggestion by the suggestion by the contract, namely. So, in other words, the contractual mechanism at every configuration cannot be delta dominated by any mechanism that can be implemented without a fear of renegotiation. You could think about this as a one-time deviation restriction on the contractual strategy. So the contract essentially is nothing but a one-time deviation restriction on design strategies after various histories of redesigns. Now, given recursive contract that satisfies consistency, completeness, and delta optimality, we can also define a mechanism that can be implemented by such a recursively renegotiation-proof contracts. And these are precisely the objective of the study. So this is basically just the formulation that we are of the structure that we are interested in. Now, okay, so I heard before that there is no actual time budget that I'm for me, but I think that it's fair that I'm trying to wrap up my talk rather soon. So I'm not going into details on how the existence proof, where the existence proof comes about, but let me just give you a very high level interpretation. And in particular, because there are people here who are interested, whose research interest has been in social choice theory, let me remark that I'm using social choice techniques, in particular covering operation. I introduce something akin to covering in the context of social choice theory on context, and there is a sort of a relationship between a binary relationship between mechanism context pairs, and over them I create a covering relationship which at the high level intuition implies that if there is a deviation from a particular context, not implementing the recommendation on the table given the current belief, if this deviation, the new mechanism, if there is a sort of a response plan on top of that mechanism that makes the mechanism unfeasible in a sense that it renders the original mechanism or the compound mechanism not incentive compatible or not individually rational, then there is kind of a blocking taking place on the mechanism that we are potentially using. Now, we can use this kind of a blocking relationship to form something that I called uncovered set. Uncovered set is the set of contexts which are not covered, which are not covered in the sense that I just tried to describe by any mechanism, assuming that the blocking mechanism has the feature that its range is in T. So that's the notion of uncovering. It's fairly easy to show that the uncovering operation is a monotone function on a complete lattice, namely the set of all subsets of contexts, and therefore admits by Tarski's fixed point theorem a maximal fixed point S star such that this condition holds. Now, the next result is based on that fixed point. A consistent, complete, and delta optimal recursive contract exists for any delta. So this is the existence result. I'm not going to go to the intuition more deeply, but let me just give you the key characterization result. So we know, on the basis of the previous result, that a recursive contract, a recursively renegotiation-proof contract exists, and therefore there is always a mechanism that can be implemented by recursively renegotiation-proof contract, given the initial context. But then there is also a rather compact characterization, if and only if characterization of mechanisms that can be implemented by that kind of a mechanism. But let me refrain from the details of that characterization. Now, the final point that I want to make is the application to bilateral bargaining situation. So let me give a little bit flesh over the bones on the bargaining situation. So as we discussed earlier, there is the buyer and the seller. The buyers, there is an outcome A is 0 or 1, depending on, or hang on, it can be a probability as well, depending on whether the trade takes place or not. And then there is a transfer between the buyer, from the buyer to the seller. And these are the utilities given A and T, the transfer of the two agents. AB is the buyer's type, AS is the seller's type. Now, as we discussed earlier, the red dots are the area where trade will never take place, even with the socially optimal mechanism. But now the question is that I want to impose: can or can we not implement this incentive efficient trade in the bilateral bargaining situation? And if not, of course, the additional question would be, what would be the commitment-free mechanism that we could implement? We know by now that we can implement something, but what is it? What is it that we can implement? That would be the question. So, well, in fact, what we can do, or what I'm going to say, is that the second. So the question is, can we implement a mechanism where only the blue dots in the areas with the blue dots trade takes place and not anywhere else? And can we commit? Can the agents commit to trade in that fashion? In other words, can the second best mechanism be implemented by a recursively renegotiation-proof contract? And let me state the outcome. Yes, in fact, that can be implemented by a recursively renegotiation-proof contract. Let me give you a sort of a very brief intuition how that can be done. It all boils down to the posterior beliefs generated by a mechanism. Suppose that we implement a second best mechanism. Then in the area in here, like the dots that I have drawn here, trade should not take place. So how can we commit to not continue trading, even if in those dots, even if we know that there is a mutually beneficial trade is waiting to be materialized? How can we commit not to trade there? Well, let's think about the following exposed belief generating mechanism. It's the second best mechanism, so that it doesn't induce trade in this area, in the dots here, but in a dot like the one in here, it reveals the type pair of the agents. In fact, it reveals, it labels, it sends a signal that coincides with the types of the agents in this dot. So if no other information is available, then indeed the agents would learn the other agent type, and of course there would be no force that could prevent them renegotiating a mutually beneficial trade in a dot like this, because both would know the other agent's type, how much the other agent values the good, and they would realize that the buyer's valuation is higher than the seller's because it's above the diagonal. So any bargaining procedure would lead to trade. So that means that cannot be the only piece of information that is generated to the agents. And what the additional piece of information is the diagonal. Suppose that we are in a diagonal, in a point like this. Then the mechanism generates this piece of information that their type combination is in the diagonal, but it also generates falsely the information that it might be here, or here, or here, or here, or here. Every diagonal point has this structure that it generates with some probability false information that they are either in the horizontal axis or in the vertical axis of or the types are in the horizontal, either in the horizontal axis or in the vertical axis. That implies that suppose that agents receive this piece of information, then it is also possible that it was generated by this diagonal point or this diagonal point. So exposed information forms a triangle like this. And this exposed information, it puts positive probability on these three isolated elements, which have this triangular structure. Only these three pairs of types receive positive probability. Now my claim is that if we have a triangular triangular belief structure like this, then the traders can commit not to continue trading. And how is that possible? It is possible in the following sense. Suppose that the traders would like to continue trading. For example, trading in here when the buyer has strictly higher valuation for the good than the seller, and then that would require that no trade would take place in the red circle and in the diagonal. But then, on the other hand, if here trade would take place, then in here, in the upper diagonal point, if that would be the case, the agent would have common knowledge that their type is in this upper triangular point, because it cannot be in the off diagonal point, and it cannot be in the lower diagonal point, because both of the players know which of the diagonal points materializes, because they know their own valuation. So if they know that their valuation is in the diagonal point, then what they can do is that they can renegotiate by instead trading at that point. That the contract can suggest legitimately that that trade will take place. Both will get zero payoff in here and in here. So, but if trade will take place here and in here, then that destroys incentives for both the agents to reveal their types truthfully to trade in here. And that destroys the incentives to reveal types truthfully and in fact to trade. And that's why incentive compatibility, that's why no trade is something that the traders can commit to in the even if they both know that there is a chance for mutually beneficial trade, because of this triangular structure which is generated by the particular features of our mechanism. So we conclude that the Myers-Satterthwaite second best bargaining mechanism is indeed implementable even without commitment, which has been a sort of a source of confusion and discussion in the literature. So okay, so these were my results. Now my final points are related to extension of the model. So nothing in the structure that we are talking about renegotiation, where we are implicitly maximizing the utility, joint utility of the agents. Nothing here requires that we are in fact maximizing the joint utility of the agents. We could think about planners, any kinds of objectives of the planner, and the planner not being able to commit to the rules of the game. And the same procedure, same solution concept could be applied there too. So, okay. So I'm hopefully no longer sharing my slides. These were my modest thoughts. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Hannu, for your presentation. It has been extremely clear, despite the very technical nature of the paper. I really enjoyed it, and I open the floor for questions, if any. Uh, Anybody wants to make a comment? Stefan?
Yeah, just for clarity. So is the contract or this mechanism transition function, is that reintroducing some sort of commitment through the back door in a way, or because of the delta optimality, you just needed to describe the thing?
So basically, the idea of the contract is that the agents or the mediator doesn't require any commitment whatsoever. The mediator can change the rules of the game, the contract, at any point, make a one or actually finitely many deviations to the contract. But the point is that she will not want to do that, because there's going to be renegotiation after renegotiation, which sort of makes the original renegotiation backwards. It doesn't work, because the second stage renegotiation makes the original renegotiation unworkable. So therefore, it's this sort of a recursive sub-game perfect kind of criterion or mechanism that guarantees that no one knows anyone will not want to make a deviation, renegotiate a contract, even though there is no external enforcement.
Thanks.
Okay, Gregor.
So I have a question I'm carrying with me, and I'm not sure if I have overseen this somewhere in your formulations and in these models, but I'm wondering about how we apply those mechanisms in praxis. And we do that, and we believe in that we have solutions for how to do it, kind of renegotiation proof. And the trick we use is a trick, I'm not sure if this is in your model, but it's about the post information if the agents even get it. Yeah, you're also talking about the post information, but our trick is to say there is the contract of the negotiation says if the prices do not cross, that's how we call it if they are in the upper triangle. Yeah, if they are above the diagonal, then the prices do not cross. And if they do not cross, they first of all agree on that there is no renegotiation and there is no deal. Yeah, no deal and no renegotiation. And then we give the prices only to a trust center, and the trust center does not give them any other information than that they do not cross in that case. Yeah, if they cross or if they are on the diagonal, yeah, then of course they get the information, what was the price and so on. And if they are in the lower edge, then they can meet in the middle. But if they do not cross, then they do not get any other information than that. Yeah. And if they do not get any other information and they already agreed on that they will not renegotiate, then yeah, why should they then renegotiate if it is the case? Yeah, so we believe in that this is a renegotiation proof mechanism with the trust center.
Sorry, I don't quite. Was there a question or was this a comment? I didn't quite.
Kind of both. The question is, if this fits into your models, could you, with your formulations, model this kind of contract, which makes sure that the agents don't get the information where the point is, if it is above the diagonal?
So okay, okay, I'm not sure if I understood your question, but the point of the whole structure here, and of course, it is not very sort of applicable. I make no claim that this is something that could be applied in the European Union, for example. But what I'm saying is that it is possible, it is consistent to create a contractual framework which conditions in a very particular way or in a precise way exposed information or assigns exposed information to the agent in a way that under exposed information renegotiation is not profitable for the agents, given that they know that if they do renegotiate it now, they are further incentivized to renegotiate in the later stage. This is kind of a, so in some sense, this is a, this is a little bit like a self-control problem of an individual. We are every now and then we are tempted to do something that is stupid, use addictive drugs, not read to an exam, or what have you. But then, and because of that, we need to have some kinds of strategies. Think about if I don't read now, then I'm going to feel terrible tomorrow, and because of that, I'm going to do some self-harmful behavior. So I rather read today. So it's kind of that's the kind of the flavor of this whole construction, and it really requires. I mean, if we deviate, so if I understood your question correctly, if we don't get the information exposed that was predicted by the contract, then everything boils down, everything collapses. So it's the whole structure is very sensitive to the details of the mechanism and the informational properties of the mechanism.
But doesn't it collapse into a way where the agents are very highly incentivized to, not truth telling, but to reveal?
Okay, that was your question. Actually, okay, that's a great question. In fact, because all the mechanisms can be committed to in this structure. Because all the mechanisms can be committed to, suggested, proposed by the contract, and all the mechanisms are required to be incentive compatible and individually rational. Indeed, agents are willing to play them truthfully. That's part of the whole construction. So they are playing truthfully the mechanism because they are incentive compatible and they are not going to be renegotiated.
Okay.
Okay. Any more question?
Yep.
Manfred.
Yeah. Well, I'm questioning a bit the last assumption you made, that all the mechanisms have to be incentive compatible, because any mechanisms, there are, so to say, a potential. They don't show up, in your recursive model. You have, in the beginning, you have a mechanism, and the question is this stable or not? And then you assume the hypothetical series, that's what I understood, of possible mechanisms. But in this possible mechanisms, don't get implemented. You could have some kind of dreams, because you pointed out to the individual. When I think about myself, then I have all kind of, when I think why I am sitting here, so to say. So alternatively, I have dreams, like being on a beach or whatever. So of course I don't want to be there, or maybe I'm very renegotiation free here in that case, but we still can think about, so to say, but this is not in your model actually, that you can think about mechanisms which are a potential and which are not consistent. The results is not consistent on all that, and you don't assume optimality in these mechanisms, which are actually only potential and will not be satisfied or will not be implemented. Does that make
Right.
sense?
So, but it is kind of a right. So for example, the recursive contract implicitly considers sequences of redesigns.
Yeah.
And of course, these redesigns, so suppose that we are in a particular history at the moment. So there is a sequence of redesigns. Of course, they are crazy redesigns because the combination of all these mechanisms could not possibly be incentive compatible. Nevertheless, we are taking them as one possible history through which we could end up to a particular point. Now, the point is not whether the sequence of hypothetical mechanisms are playable in incentive compatible manner if you put them together, for example, but rather to make sure that even if we make these hypothetical deviations, we don't. Or let me put it the other way. If we do a hypothetical deviation, we need to understand what is going to be the consequence of that deviation. If the consequence of the deviation is such that the deviation is harmful for us, it will never take place. It will take place with probability 0. That's the idea of game theory. So even though things will not ever materialize, we nevertheless have to understand what's going to happen after them, even if they are crazy deviations. So if I understood your question correctly, which is actually a very good one, so we are thinking about counterfactual hierarchies of deviations, infinite, unboundedly deep hierarchies of counterfactual deviations or redesigns. They will never take place, ever. But nevertheless, we need to understand what would happen if they would take place. That's the reason why they will not take place. I mean, that's the idea of nuclear weapons. They are not going to be used, but it's precisely they are never going to be
Hopefully you're
used
right.
because they are crazy.
Hopefully you're right on this, but it's, I mean, the basic, very basic model is an empty threat, really, you know, in a game. It's still there, you know. You see, and you could also say this renegotiations of mechanisms which are just potentially there, you know, because you don't, players will not renegotiate the first one, you know.
Yeah.
Um,
So they are
Whether they do
completely.
it or not, it depends, of course, you know, on these kind of fictionals or potential ones. Huh? Then
Yeah,
you
I
can
mean
have
they
this.
are completely fictional. They will never take place. They
Yeah,
are, but that's the reason why. Yeah, I mean it's a completely fictional thing, obviously. The only thing that takes place is the original mechanism that is going to be implemented. Everything else is there just to make sure that indeed we can commit to this original mechanism.
yeah. But of course, the stability, let's say, of the original mechanism depends on kind of what kind of fictionals mechanisms you allow.
Absolutely, absolutely. And at each point, so that's the kind of the core idea that at each hypothetical scenario we should still follow the rules of logic.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I have I mean, just a small suggestion. I'm not familiar with this literature, but I am familiar with evolutionary and the repeated game literature. And I'm wondering, for example, you mentioned that your mechanism is an automaton, which needs to be unbounded and infinite.
Yes. Yes.
And I wonder how crucial is this assumption for your result? Because you might think that if you put any bound in the complexity of the amount of the automaton that you are going to use, your result collapses. And
Oh yeah, yeah.
also,
That's
if
actually a
you
very good point.
imagine,
So in some sense, yes. So it is, the automaton is infinite in a sense that it has to be conditioned on or the state space in the automaton has to contain uh, the set of all contexts, which
yeah,
contains all the probability distributions,
yeah.
possible probability distributions, and there are going to be infinitely many of them.
Yeah.
So
But there is also another way in which it can collapse, even if you assume that you can have an infinite automaton. If you imagine that every state of the automaton costs you epsilon, so there is a literature on
yeah,
complexity
yeah,
cost. And now,
yeah,
if
yeah.
it costs epsilon, if it's infinite, the number of states, then I mean, if you're bargaining over a finite pie, and we need an infinite automaton to decide, eventually the cost of the automaton is going to be larger than the pie.
Yes,
So
yes.
I think that in this sense, your result is a bit delicate to the assumption that something
That's
you need
so.
something infinite. So
Yeah, 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 yeah.
this
Yeah, yeah,
is
yeah, yeah.
this is
So yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, I 100% agree. It is a delicate. This is one of the dimensions in which the result is rather delicate. So it's a. But yeah, yeah, it would be nice to have a finite automaton. Unfortunately, I don't think that it's a possibility. But it's a little bit the same. I mean, if you think about repeated games, well, repeated games are they have a particular structure. So the amount of the number of I mean, of course, there are infinitely many histories in repeated games, but the informational content in histories doesn't change, except concerning the strategies. But here it is precisely the informational content that changes from one history or not to another, because the beliefs can change of the types of the agents. So in that sense, it is so the relevant counterpart of this result is the stochastic games literature, where there are thinking about all kinds of uncertainties which can materialize. Quite often we assume Markovian strategies which are not history dependent, and for a very good reason, for the reason that you just explained, that complexity considerations would lead to simple strategies like Markov strategies. Here we are taking full advantage of the information that is hidden into the histories. But that, of course, the drawback, or the whole solution is based on exploiting the information in these histories, and there is massive amount of information there, and restricting our ability to use that information, of course, makes would imply that the solution would not exist. But I totally agree. It's not a very it's a difficulty. It's definitely a difficulty or delicate feature of the solution.
If I can add just a suggestion on where to look, Jeren Zwinkels has a paper on evolutionary games. He defines a notion of stability against equilibrium entrance. And the idea in that paper is that a strategy needs not to be stable against any possible mutant, but against the mutants that make sense. So mutants that are optimal in the ex post population, okay? So it restricts the number of mutants, but it restricts only to a first stage. So he says, okay, my strategy needs to be stable against the mutants who are optimal against the population after the mutant, but he doesn't consider other mutants over the first mutants. So he cuts the number at the first stage. I wonder whether this kind of approach could help you in this. You say, okay,
I have to look at the paper. I don't know the paper, but thanks for the tip.
If you look at that paper, in your paper, it would be something like it needs to be stable against something which makes sense after one stage, not considering every possible.
Yeah. That would be a simplification, definitely.
It would be a weaker. My impression is that it's going to be a weaker solution, but maybe you don't need your infinite automaton, and in this case, it's going to be more robust. That's my suggestion.
Great point. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay. More questions? Okay. If there are no more questions, I think we can stop here. Thank you for attending. Thank you, Hannu, for your presentation. Thank you, Manfred, for organizing this wonderful seminar. And
thank you so much.
Florian is
thank you very much.
A lot of people organizing. Thank you, Manfred. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, I thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, goodbye.
Bye.
We see you again.
Bye.
We see you again. Huh?